Doesn't every great sailboat story have a supersonic, super high altitude jet interceptor in it? Today, everything you need to know about C&C. C&C Boats may not be a name you've actually heard of, but that's because for most of its life, it's been Canadian. I always say that most sailors share a few common interests outside of sailboats, and one of those things is motorcycles. We all seem to like those. The other thing is aircraft, or flying, or piloting. It seems to be a really common thing for all sailors. Our C&C story today starts with a dude named George Cassian and a jet called the Avro Arrow. The Arrow was a project to build a supersonic, super high altitude jet interceptor for the Royal Canadian Air Force. And yes, we do have an Air Force in Canada, and no, it's not reindeer. When the Arrow project was dismantled, George Cassian found himself looking for work, and he and another Canadian sailor got together to do something really cool, something legendary. The year was 1961, and George Cassian brought his aircraft engineering know-how and his good friend, also called George Cuthbertson. You ever heard of him? Cuthbertson brought his experience designing boats. This is where the C&C comes from, Cassian and Cuthbertson. The C&C story is not actually a story about boats for me. It's more a story about a business that revolutionized the sailboat world from a business standpoint, and they built, or designed at least, some of the greatest racing yachts ever made. While George Cassian was hanging out on the supersonic jet scene, cool spot, George Cuthbertson had already designed a few sailboats of note. One of them is Innisfree, a 54-foot racing yacht. This is where my personal experience with C&C sort of begins. A Cuthbertson design, which later became the Whitby 45, was a boat that I ran with in upstate New York for a while. If you remember from the Lady K videos, its massive swept back fin keel kept getting stuck in the mud on the Erie Canal, and I towed that heavy girl, not only off the mud, but many, many miles down the Erie Canal.
Alright, our buddy boat just stopped, so we did a U-turn. We're headed back down, eastbound, to see what's up. Lady K here.
No 6'8".
6'8".
Lady K, Bagari.
Bagari, go ahead.
Ground, sir.
You are aground. Holy moly, you're in the channel.
3.7 feet.
Jesus, can you back up?
Was that a rhetorical question?
Semi-rhetorical, yeah. Do you want me to pull your bow over to port?
Yes, sir. That was not the best. One of reverse right now. It's not moving at all. We're ground pretty good.
All right, throw me a line off your bow and I'll pull you to port.
So the Georges started building smaller wooden boats and solid fiberglass hull yachts, but they really didn't get their big break until one of their designs hit a home run. It was actually to become the Hinterholer Invader 36. So a C&C design, the Georges designed it, but Hinterholer actually built it, which is sort of a lot of the C&C mantra. They design really good boats and then somebody else sort of builds them. An Invader 36 owner, one of the guys who bought one of these things, was a real estate guy, also a Canadian. His name was Perry Connolly, and he came back with his Invader 36 that he loved, came back to the Georges, and he said, I want you to build me a custom, one-off boat that I'm going to win races all over the world with. The story is they were at a Toronto Maple Leafs game, hockey game, if you don't know, and undoubtedly the Toronto Maple Leafs were losing. It's what they do, sadly. But they were discussing the design of this boat in between breaks in the game, in between the periods. So it's a pretty cool story. It's almost like, the design was written on a bar napkin kind of thing. But Perry requested, and this is pretty cool, he requested the meanest, the hungriest 40-footer afloat. I like this guy. The Georges, of course, were all too happy to oblige and built this 40-foot monster. But they ended up building something even more important than that. The first, and this impacts you, the first on-record boat ever engineered to be balsa core between two layers of fiberglass. That's very, very important because that became the industry standard, and I think all of us have owned a balsa cord between two layers of fiberglass sailboat. It's how they do things. The boat was built, again, not by C&C, they designed it, but it was built by Bruckman Manufacturing. And the boat was actually named the Red Jacket, which you probably have heard of. She was launched in 1966 and won 11 of her first 13 race starts. Pretty wild right out of the gate. That winter, she went south to compete in the Southern Ocean Racing Conference, SORC. And she won a number of races there against 85 of the best racers in the world. The next year, Perry took the Red Jacket back to the SOHC and became the first Canadian boat to win the whole thing. George and George were now on the map, the international yacht racing map. The world took notice, and anything designed by C&C or George and George was suddenly in huge demand. This is where the business of sailboat building comes into play. The Georges saw the potential of what was happening with their new company and their designs, so they took action, definitive action. They joined forces with their builders like Bruckman, who built the Red Jacket, Belleville Marine, and none other than George Hinterholer, to form the company C&C Yachts Limited in 1969. The company was traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and when they IPO'd the company, suddenly they had $1.5 million of capital to play with. That buys a lot of stuff in 1969. Mass-producing fiberglass boats in 1969 was sort of a new idea, but C&C got started the Georges. They even stockpiled boats in the off-season to deliver to dealers in the spring, which allowed them a lot of time to innovate and organize things. Their original plant in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is just the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, had almost everything in-house, from glass and metalwork, rigging and upholstery. The only thing they outsourced was the casting of the lead keel. And I sort of get that, because lead really sucks to deal with. But it wasn't all big business and boring. These guys were still out there racing. In a cup race between Canada and the US, a C&C designed boat actually beat the American Sparkman and Stevens design boat, which is great as a Canadian, but it also sort of bugs me because I have a Sparkman and Stevens design boat. Race wins were stacking up after that. In 1971, a C&C won Class B overall at the SORC and the Montego Bay race. A C&C won Chicago to Mac. In 72, a C&C Redline 41 SHOC overall. And a C&C 43 won both the Nassau and Governor's Cups. After that, high oil prices, a weird economy, a strong Canadian dollar allowed C&C, as still a Canadian company, to grow rapidly, opening factories all over the place, Canada, the US, Germany. They just went nuts. With great success, though, and a will to win, usually comes some controversy, and of course C&C was not immune to this controversy. The rules of racing got tighter and tighter and tighter, and manufacturers of the time, this is mid-70s, started to find loopholes, or cheat, as it were. It sort of became like NASCAR, where you could shave off here and shave off there. In 1978, and this is sort of when the stuff hit the fan, a C&C race design 41-footer ruffled a lot of feathers. It won the Canada's Cup, but it ended up losing its mast on a shakedown cruise on the Great Lakes, and it was ruled due to design issues. It was a cheater boat called Evergreen. A couple of the examples of things this boat did that were sort of like shaving the rules a little bit. One of the rules was the boats have to have a galley sink. Fine, let's put a galley sink in all the boats just to meet the rules, right? But the rule didn't specify that the sink had to have a drain. You know, they didn't think of that when they wrote the rule. So, of course, the C&C Evergreen, C&C designed Evergreen, they didn't put a galley sink drain on the galley sink, just to save weight, 3 ounces or whatever a drain weighs in a tube and all that kind of stuff. So, weird. Also, the deck hatches all opened inward to avoid windage up top. And that seems okay, except that if you capsize or broach, that could be catastrophic. It could be really bad because the water will push the hatches inward. They need to sit on top of the deck where they can't push inward. Little things like this, and they did a lot of them. So the 41-footer made a lot of people angry. She was eventually at the Fastnet race of 79. And if you know anything about sailing, you know how that turned out. Fastnet 79, look that up. The cheater boats needed to stop after this. And of course, all of the rules were rewritten after Fastnet 79, and ultimately C&C was not invited to come back. In more recent years, C&C was bought and sold more times than I can even recount. And in 1994, the original factory, Niagara-on-the-Lake, burned down, which actually destroyed countless molds and designs and drawings made by the original Georges, which really sucks. Later on, there were designs and molds and things like that that were actually donated to a museum in Kingston, Ontario, so you can actually go see some of the original Georges work, which, you know, that's pretty cool. Even if you haven't heard of C&C until now, I'm sure you've heard of other manufacturers that C&C has actually designed boats for. Remember how I said C&C designed more boats than they actually made? They designed boats for C&C Yachts, Mirage, Northern, Newport, Ontario Yachts, Pace Ship, and even Tanzer. Their drawings were everywhere. I've personally owned one C&C, and it was the boat I owned right before Lady K. It was a C&C Redline 25, and Redline is their really go-fast version of their boats. My second sailboat, it had a shoal draft, and then it had a drop board, a 6-foot drop board that came out, or swing keel, that came out of the bottom of the shoal draft. It pointed higher than any boat I've ever been on. And I've sailed on a lot of C&C boats as well, more than I can count. And I'd say that in my club, where there's about 50 boats, at least 5 of them are branded C&C boats. And I bet you anything, at least 10 of them are of C&C design. If you saw my post a while back during the summer, I was out on somebody's boat and we snapped a backstay. We were out in 25 to 30 knot winds, we were pointed up hard, and we were cutting right up into the wind as high as this thing would point. And of course the backstay snapped. It was on a hydraulic sort of pump arrangement for the backstay. It was a race boat. That was a C&C. And I don't blame C&C for the backstay snapping. It was just sort of something that happened on an older boat. But good Lord, are they fast. Out of the line of C&Cs that most people know, it's the Landfall series of boats, which is sort of weird because there's not a lot of information out there. I've never been on one. I've never even seen a Landfall boat. But C&C Landfall was C&C's effort to make a 35 to mid 40 foot ocean cruising, you're going to the Caribbean sort of couples or families cruising boat. The Landfall was a fairly successful thing in its time, and it was just aimed at ocean cruising. They're known to point fairly high, and they're also known to be fairly comfortable. C&C boats can quickly be identified when you're looking at one because they have an indented or engraved stripe down the side right under the tow rail with a star at the back that's actually engraved into the fiberglass as well. But a C&C designed boat, you'd really have to look at sailboat data. And if at the bottom of sailboat data you see that the hull was designed by Cuthbertson, you know it's a proper C&C. So where does that leave us with C&C? To be honest with you, for me, if I was looking at a C&C that met my needs for space and speed and rig and all that kind of stuff, and it was in good shape, I certainly wouldn't hesitate to buy one. If you liked today's video, shoot me a thumbs up. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to help support the channel for a couple of bucks an episode, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/LadyKSailing. I will see you guys next week.